Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called Encounters with UFO Occupants 10 True Cases. I love these kinds of cases where people have face-to-face meetings with extraterrestrials of all different kinds. I think all UFO cases are interesting, but these to me are among the most fascinating because there's little chance of misperception when someone has a face-to-face encounter with a humanoid or an ET, someone who's clearly not from here. These cases, I think, have the most to teach us about who these ETs are, where they come from, and what their agenda is on our planet. And there's so many of them. I don't think the general public has any idea just how common this is. And let's face it, the vast majority of people do not report their encounters, especially if it's a very close encounter, like the ones I'd like to present today. So any estimates of how common this is are probably vastly underestimated. The cases I chose today date all the way back to the 1920s up to the 1990s. This is important because, again, it shows this is an ongoing phenomenon. I've chosen cases from all over the world. So we have cases from across the United States, from Canada, South America, Europe, of course, and Australia. Again, important because this shows that this is a worldwide phenomena. I think every location on this planet probably has a long and rich history of UFO encounters. Some of these are single witness cases. Many are multiple witness cases. A lot of them do have not only corroborative witnesses, outside witnesses, but evidence as well. The evidence is in the normal kinds we often see. So I'm talking about landing traces, of course, animal reactions, electromagnetic disturbances, and physiological effects. And each case provides another piece of the puzzle to what's going on our planet in regards to UFOs and extraterrestrials. So 10 true cases, let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about, I call the saucer in the celery field. This is a really interesting case because it took place quite early and yet shows some elements that we would see much later. And this took place in October 1928 in an undisclosed location in Wisconsin. This is not a officially or thoroughly investigated case, but nevertheless, I think it's an important and certainly an interesting case. This very unusual case was first revealed by Genevieve Johnston, who is the editor of the vintage UFO magazine Interplanetary News Digest. She received a very interesting letter from an 80-year-old lady from Kentucky, and it's definitely one of those cases that raises a lot of questions. As the witness wrote in her letter, way back in October of 1928, one of the flying saucers landed only 50 feet from my farm in a celery field in Wisconsin. Several small people emerged and ran into the woods. Now, according to the witness, these little men were all dressed in one-piece, neat-fitting coveralls. They were light blue-gray in color and had head caps that were fit and shaped almost exactly like the aviator caps of World War I, she said, which could be folded flat and kind of put into a pocket. She said that these figures also all wore soft white shoes that reminded her of moccasins. And I will just quote this witness again, this 80-year-old lady from Kentucky. As she says, I examined the ship very thoroughly, inside and out. It measured 99 feet in length and 30 feet in diameter. It had 14 portholes on each side, a small door near the front end, no mechanism of any kind for guiding or power. There were 7 bucket seats and a great quantity of food near the front part of the ship. This food was very similar in size, shape, and texture to the wafers we buy and feed to our goldfish. and it tasted delightful. So yeah, this lady actually walked inside this craft and examined it, tasted one of these wafers. Very unusual. So after exploring this ship, she returned to her farm. She says the little men she saw never returned, but she does say that the General Electric Company actually retrieved the craft and brought it to their laboratory for study. She says she was told that the elements this craft was composed of did not come from Earth. This incident was completely covered up from the public, though according to the witness, she learned that there were at least a dozen other UFO landings between 1919 and 1930 throughout northern Wisconsin and Illinois, with each of these saucers containing somewhere between 5 to 7 little people inside. So yes, this is a very brief, uninvestigated, and unsubstantiated report, but certainly this very early mention of a so-called UFO crash retrieval. It also has elements, as I said, that echo future reports, such as the ETs wearing tight gray coveralls, a ship with no visible mechanisms or engines inside, and even those food-like wafers she mentioned have been discussed in other cases, such as the Aztec, New Mexico UFO crash of 1948. So there's some very interesting details to this case that I think have the ring of authenticity. What I like about that case are several things. The fact that it landed in a celery field, I find that kind of interesting. Or the ETs after the celery, I don't know, we don't have any indication of that. But it's also interesting because the witness was able to go on board. She described the interior of the UFO with details that we often see in modern day accounts. She alludes to the possibility or the probability that craft are being recovered by our own governments. And other interesting details that we've seen in other cases, which I think lends credence to this account. So yeah, it wasn't officially investigated, but still super interesting. But now we move to another case which was officially investigated, and I call this the WAVERLY UFO Landing and Humanoid. I like this case because it is a multiple witness case. It does have evidence in the form of landing traces, and it's just darn interesting. The main witness in this case is a 14-year-old boy by the name of David Gibson. This took place, of course, on August 13, 1965 in Waverly, Iowa. And David was sitting with his father and sister in their yard of their Waverly home when a high-pitched whining sound drew their attention upward. Looking up, they saw a metallic, polished aluminum-looking object, which they estimate was about 15 to 20 feet wide. They said it looked like, quote, two saucers glued together, and it moved quickly overhead at quite a low level. But to their amazement, it descended slowly and actually disappeared behind a hill about a third mile away, and it looked like it was coming in for a landing. And in fact, they could hear this whining sound fade away. So curious, David, the 14-year-old, jumped up and went alone to investigate. And going up the hill, about 400 to 500 feet away from him, he saw a short being standing at the top of the hill, peeking out from behind a tree, watching him. Here's the little drawing he made of this. So this creature, he said, was about 3 to 3.5 feet tall and bald-headed. He ran towards it to get a closer look, but tripped and looked down for an instant, and when he looked back up, the creature was gone. So he didn't get a super good look at it, but could definitely tell it was not human. And seconds later, he saw a blur and heard a rushing sound like air, and he watched this same object go straight up in about 2 to 3 seconds. He ran up to the tree where he had seen this little figure peeking behind it, and he found no evidence that this being had been there, but exploring the area, he did come upon a perfectly round area of burned grass. This was in a nearby quarry. And this burned patch was about 15 to 20 feet in diameter, which matches what they saw in terms of this craft. And the grass inside the circle was blackened, but outside, of course, it was all still green. And inside this burned area, David did find 3 rectangular indentations, each about 2 feet from the edge of the circle. Each of them was 1 inch deep, 5 inches wide, and 1 foot long. What's also interesting is that the soil in this area was hard and firm, which indicates that this object must have been quite heavy to make those indentations. So seeing this, David returned home and informed his father, and presumably they went back and examined this circle because they next went to the Waverly Police Department and told them about the encounter, but the Waverly Police refused to even examine the landing site. This case was reported on by Jim and Coral Lorenzen of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, and as Coral Lorenzen writes, "This is typical of so many reports we receive here at headquarters. Valuable data at the site of the landing has been lost because of the refusal of authorities to investigate." Certainly an interesting case, and what a shame that the police didn't even bother to investigate it. This just shows how effective the UFO cover-up has been, that officials whose job it is to investigate anything unusual refuse to even come out and take a look. It's too bad. But there's always another case. And the next case I'd like to talk about is super interesting. I call this one ETs Investigate Earthquake. This took place on August 3rd, 1967 in Caracas, Venezuela. This was officially investigated. It is a multiple witness case, and it's quite unusual because it took place immediately following a very large earthquake. That, I think, is significant, but let's just get into it and you can decide for yourself. It was on July 31st, 1967 that a 6.6 earthquake struck Caracas, Venezuela. This was a big earthquake and it lasted for almost a minute, and an estimated 300 people tragically lost their lives. Now, Juan and Maria de Soto lived in the suburbs of Caracas in the hills surrounding the city center. Thankfully, they were uninjured by the earthquake, but it did damage their home, cracking one of the walls. And fearing that staying in their damaged home in the days following the earthquake could lead to further injuries, Juan and Maria decided to sleep in their car in front of their home along with their teenage son. And it was 3 days after this 6.6 earthquake, at around 11:30 p.m. on August 3rd, that Juan de Soto woke up to see a glowing white disc-shaped object hovering about 100 feet over the palm tree right by their front door. So he quickly woke up his wife Maria so she could also see the object. Their teenage son slept in the back seat and they did not wake him up. But they could see this disc clearly. They estimate it was about 30 feet wide and was so bright it lit up the whole front yard, including their greenhouse, which was attached next door. They said there was no wind, but strangely, the leaves in the trees were swaying back and forth. They did hear a slight humming sound, and as they watched, an opening appeared in the bottom of the disc, and a smaller glowing white, light bulb-shaped object emerged and descended to the ground, stopping only a few inches above the ground. And then a door in the side slid open, and out stepped this 3-foot-tall, luminous figure dressed in a coverall, complete with a helmet. And it took a few steps and began to pick up some of the gravel stones, which made up the gravel walkway to the house. Now at this point, the De Sotos were only about 15 feet away from this figure, so very close. In fact, they were close enough that they could see vapor around the figure's head, which they thought might be its breath. Now, for about 10 minutes, they watched this figure walking around and examining the gravel, picking it up. He didn't take any of the gravel, but would pick it up and put it back on the walkway. They did notice that the figure would tip its head back and look up at the object above him as if communicating with it. And this is when they saw the vapor apparently coming out of its mouth. Then, every now and then, it would turn and look at the car. Now, Juan and Maria weren't sure if this figure knew it was being observed, but they were too afraid to go out and confront it. Finally, this figure stopped picking up the gravel stones, dropped them, returned back into this smaller light bulb shaped craft, which immediately floated back up into the larger one, and as soon as it was inside this larger craft, the door closed and the larger craft darted away in just a few seconds. So Juan and Maria were absolutely shocked by this encounter, and even though they had each other as witnesses, they wondered if they had somehow dreamed or hallucinated the whole experience, which lasted for about 15 minutes, which is a long time. But the next morning, 3 of their neighbors called them to ask if they had seen the glowing disc, which had hovered directly over their house. So they got confirmation. Investigators heard about this. The DeSotos agreed to an investigation. They initially requested anonymity, but finally did allow their names to be used. And as it turns out, that summer, there were many other sightings in the Caracas area. Definitely a really unusual case. If I was the DeSoto's son, I'd be so mad that they didn't wake me up. What a shame. But yeah, multiple witness case. I really wonder why the ET was gathering the gravel and examining it. Could this have anything to do with the recent earthquake? I think it's definitely a possibility. But it is interesting because this was just one of several very significant UFO encounters in that area at that time. It's certainly an important case. And now we move to our next one, which took place in Coleraine in Quebec, Canada on August 29, 1968. This actually took place over a couple of days. It's a multiple witness case. There's some really interesting aspects to it, particularly what the humanoid looked like. And I call this one Bald and Bearded Red Reptilian in a Graveyard. That's quite a mouthful, but it's a really interesting case and one of many which have taken place in graveyards. This very strange case began when a group of young boys were playing, quote, cowboys and saw something very strange. The first witness was 7-year-old Dennis Bogus. He saw a strange figure sort of standing or hanging on a boulder that overlooked a cemetery near his home in Coleraine, where they were playing. But it was the next 2 days, August 30th and 31st, that got the attention of the adults. Because it was around 4 to 6:30 p.m., the kids were out there playing, and this weird figure appeared again in this same location. And this time it was viewed not only by Dennis, but by his 2 brothers, Michel and Andre. But it wasn't just the kids who saw it this time. Their uncle, George Bogus, and 2 other adults, Normand Deigel and Luc Caderet, also saw this weird figure. And all the witnesses agree on the details that this figure was about 4 feet tall, bald with no hair, but did have a long black beard and was bare-chested. This weird dwarf-like figure had reddish skin that looked, quote, like that of a lizard. So it was kind of bumpy, not smooth. And again, he was seen at this same boulder. Now at one point the boys heard this roaring noise and looking for the source did see a, quote, flying saucer. They described this object as being blue, white, and red, about 30 feet wide, and it appeared to be trying to land behind the boulder, and it was seen on both days. When it departed, it left behind a sort of trail of smoke, a contrail. Now, Uncle George Bogus didn't believe the boys at first when they were talking about this, but of course on September 1st he saw it himself. And the next day, on September 2nd, he returned to the location with literally 100 other people in the hopes of a repeat performance. Unfortunately, the UFO and its occupant did not show up and apparently never returned. I think there's some important takeaways from that case. One is when your children come running up and said that they've seen something, pay attention to them. Because this case wasn't taken seriously until adults themselves became witnesses. And what a case it was, taking place over a period of days with a landed craft and a very strange humanoid. I think it might be significant that it took place in a graveyard, because there are many cases where UFOs have hovered over graveyards or even landed and humanoids are seen. In fact, I did a whole episode on just graveyard encounters, so you might want to check that out. This case definitely belongs in that category. And now we move to another case, which actually did get quite a bit of publicity. If you're a real UFO aficionado, you may have heard of this one. I call this one the thing on the stairs. And it's quite an unusual case. It is a single witness case, but it's got some very interesting aspects to it, including animal reactions and how it so profoundly affected the witness. This one took place on September 15, 1968 on the island of Cyprus. This case, from researcher Jenny Randalls, got quite a bit of attention due to its extreme high strangeness. The witness in this case is known only by his initials, KBJ, but we do know that he was an ambulance driver who was, at the time of his encounter, a non-commissioned officer in the British Army stationed at Dhekelia Army Barracks in Cyprus. And it was around 3 a.m. on September 15, 1968, and he was guarding a section of the upper barracks. With him was a large guard dog, a Turkish wolfhound, who was reportedly unafraid of anything. But around 3 a.m., suddenly the dog's hair bristled and he began growling. KBJ tried to calm the dog down, but then this poor dog began to shake and cry, and finally actually crawled underneath the bed in apparent fear. And it was at this point that the witness heard a high-pitched sound, which he said penetrated painfully inside of his head. So he got up to investigate, opened the door leading to a downward staircase to go see what was going on. And to his fear and amazement, he saw this strange figure coming up the stairs, seemingly floating. And boy, this figure looked exceedingly strange. It was humanoid in form. It wore a tight-fitting light blue overall and what looked like a dog collar studded with lugs around its neck. But it did have a very flat face, extremely large eyes, what looked like thick, rough, red hair sticking straight out about 4 inches in all directions. It had a glowing orange aura around it, and as the witness watched, this figure rotated its head in an impossible 180 degrees and stared directly at the witness. This absolutely freaked KBJ, the witness, out, and he slammed the door shut and locked it. And it was at this point that this high-pitched noise increased. So with his hands shaking and teeth chattering, he retreated to the bed and sat down. Underneath, the guard dog was still whimpering loudly, and hearing this sliding noise approaching the door, the witness decided to grab a spear gun, normally used for underwater, and he quickly loaded it. He very nearly fired it at the door, but thankfully, after a few moments, he heard what he believed was this creature sliding away, at which time this high-pitched noise finally stopped. He was still quite frightened, so he remained there unmoving until about 4:15 when the guard for the new shift arrived. Now, following this encounter, the witness, KBJ, said that his arm, leg, and shoulder ached for a week from handling this spear gun with what Jenny Randles called, quote, super strength. But the dog was affected perhaps even worse and became, as Jenny Randles writes, quote, a devout coward, throwing its legs up into the air on its back at any threat, no matter how insignificant. This just goes to show how profoundly an encounter can affect not only the person, but the animals as well. What a wild case that is. To me, the most interesting aspect of that case is the humanoid itself. It's so unusual. I don't know that I've ever heard anyone else describe a humanoid with quite those details. And it just goes to show there is a wide variety of humanoid types seen, but they're almost always humanoid. Apparently, we do share a common ancestry. This is what many contactees have been told, and this is certainly what the evidence is showing us. And now, moving along to the state of Missouri. A really interesting case. Of all the cases in this little collection, this one I think intrigues me the most. I call this one, A UFO Landed in My Backyard. This took place in early January of 1969 in Edina, Missouri. And it's quite an unusual case involving a single witness, though there are electromagnetic effects. But this UFO landed right in this lady's backyard, and the description of the occupant that she saw inside this UFO is also really interesting. It was the first or second week of January 1969, and Adeline Davis, aka Addie, was not sleeping very well in her home on Lafayette Street as her daughter was feeling unwell and Adeline was taking care of her. Then suddenly, for no reason that she could determine, Adeline bolted upright in bed and looked out the window. She didn't hear anything, but she said something woke her up, and looking out her window, she saw a strange craft had landed in her backyard, right outside of her window. And inside of this craft, through a central window, which was all lit up, she saw a strange-looking figure, an occupant, and it was looking right at her. So all of this looked so strange to her, so absolutely unbelievable, she literally could not believe her eyes and seriously considered that she might be dreaming. To determine whether she was dreaming, she pinched herself, she hit herself, she jumped up and down. She actually ran into the bathroom and splashed her face with water to determine that she was, in fact, truly awake. And of course she was. And returning to the bedroom to look out the window, no surprise, the craft was still there and this strange entity inside of it. And it was only 6 feet away. She described this craft in detail. As you can see from this drawing, the object was shaped like 2 deep bowls placed rim to rim with a rectangular midsection composed of 3 windows. She said the craft was army green with a rough metallic finish. It rested on 3 sort of rust-colored landing legs. The windows themselves were tinted blue. There were 2 red lights on either side and a white beam of light which came out of the bottom. Strangely, this beam of light shone straight down and then made this impossible right degree turn. So clearly not a normal beam of light. But strangest of all was this UFO occupant. He was male, he looked mostly human, though according to Adeline, his eyes were slanted and widespread, and his pupils had this weird sort of, quote, fuzzy or indefinite aspect to them. She saw no hair, but does say that he was wearing what looked like an army cap, a dark jacket with a small upright collar with scalloped edges, and what looked like a scarf. Now when she first saw him, he was looking down into the craft and seemed to be working on something below the window. Then suddenly he raised his head, stared directly at Adeline, and his mouth dropped open with an obvious look of surprise. He stared at her for just a brief moment, then looked back down and continued doing whatever it was he had been doing. He then reached up and looked again at Adeline, and it was at that moment that this craft began to back slowly away from the house about 10 feet, stopped, turned slightly. Adeline was still in a state of shock and disbelief. She rushed back to the bathroom, splashed more water on her face, and returned to the bedroom window. The object was of course still there, though now it hovered about 3 to 5 feet off the ground, and this is when she could really see this weird beam of light that made a right degree turn. Then slowly this craft moved off around the house and was gone. So badly shook up, Adeline went into the living room to smoke a cigarette and calm down, and this is when she noticed that the furnace fan, which runs constantly, was now not running. But within a minute or two, it started up again. So she figured that there must have been a power failure, and later, checking the clocks in the house, she saw that all of them were running about 20 minutes slow. So this showed that there had been a power interruption while the object was there, and that the encounter in totality had lasted about 20 minutes. Strangely, she says, she felt no fear during the encounter, though the next day she felt very nervous for the entire day. Now she did ask the neighbors. They didn't see anything, nor did they report any power failure, but she did report her case, and this is how it came to be investigated by UFO researchers. I think you'll agree that's a super interesting case. The description of the UFO craft itself, the description of this human-looking ET, mostly human. I honestly wonder if this could have been one of ours, and yet here's this thing landing right in somebody's backyard. If this is truly a U.S. military test craft, why would it do it? And this ET seemed very surprised to be observed, assuming this is an ET. And if this was actually a human, probably he wouldn't be so surprised, given the fact that this craft landed right next to somebody's bedroom window. It's certainly a fascinating case on a number of different levels. And now we move to the next case. This one is super unusual. Probably one of the most unusual cases in this whole collection. Though I have to say I think they're all unusual. This one is off the charts weird. I call this one Sucked Through the Window. This case took place on April 2nd, 1971 in Greenhill, Australia, and some very interesting aspects to it. It is mostly a single witness case in terms of seeing a humanoid, but there are corroborating witnesses who saw UFOs in the area at the time. This does involve the husband of a couple, and his wife did see part of the experience take place as well. So it was investigated too. By that, it, I think, means it's pretty well corroborated, and certainly seems to be an absolutely genuine case with some physical evidence, and just super strange, as we shall see. This very strange event occurred to a husband and wife in their home in Greenhill. This is in New South Wales, Australia. They do want to remain anonymous, though they did submit to a thorough investigation by researchers. And it was around 10 p.m. on April 2nd, 1971, when the husband, who is of Aboriginal descent, went into the kitchen to get a glass of water. And looking up through the kitchen window, he was shocked to see a strange round face looking through the window back at him. So he could see that this was not normal. The head was bald, but he really didn't get a chance to look more closely because the next thing he knew, he was being lifted up and sucked directly through the window, which shattered. He blacked out for just a second and found himself falling down at the bottom of the outside steps on his back. Now, unknown to him at the time, his wife actually watched at least part of this happen. As he was being sucked through the window, she heard the sound of the window breaking. She thought her husband had perhaps dropped some dishes, so she rushed into the kitchen and she saw her husband floating in a horizontal position through the window, which was now, of course, broken. He was several feet above the floor in a position that would be impossible to do by jumping on his own. All she could see was the lower half of his body, and she says that he was not, quote, struggling or thrashing about at all, just going through like that, straight out. And she describes this whole event in detail to researchers. As the wife says, "We came home from the neighbors at about 10 o'clock after watching television. My husband went to bed and was playing with the baby. He got up and went into the kitchen to have a drink of water. He didn't turn on the light, but he said afterwards he tipped his head back and saw this little face pressed against the window. It had no hair and it looked like a small saucer. It had features, but he did not describe them. He doesn't remember much about going through the window. He says he was sucked out by some force. He fell out at the bottom of the steps on his back. I ran outside. I thought he would be stunned, but he wasn't. He wasn't even winded. He jumped up and ran like hell down to the gravel. I ran after him and he was crying and shaking. I thought he had the horrors, and I told him so. I went back to the house, and he told me not to leave him there. He was so frightened." Now, this guy did not really want to give a formal interview, but he told his wife, "You think I'm mad. I'm not. I saw something. I saw something." And his wife says, "I know he saw something. He's not superstitious. He doesn't believe in ghosts or men from space. He does now." But he was so shaken up by this and slightly injured as well. They ended up going to the hospital where the husband was given a stitch to close a wound on his finger. And they are both mystified about what happened. This window he went through was only 32 inches wide and 10 inches deep. He touched nothing on the sink in front of him, and he actually fell down more than 7 feet to the bottom of the steps, which is quite a distance. So while this husband did have a clear recollection of the incident that night, get this, the next morning when he woke up, he told his wife that he needed to go fix the neighbor's window because he remembered putting his fist through it. He thought this was how he had hurt his finger, and she had to tell him that no, the neighbor's window was fine, and that he had actually cut his finger by being pulled through the kitchen window. Now, he had no memory of this at this point. Now, later, investigators discovered that several people had reported strange light in that exact area on that night. It was a few hours before the incident. Ina Murphy and her family, who lived on Gabriel Avenue, they saw a bright red-purple light descend near the hospital near their home. At the same time, Arnold Nelson of Taylor Street, he saw the same light over the McLean River. Another couple, the Andrews, were driving over the Bloomfield Street Bridge when they saw apparently the same light. And there are more witnesses. Finally, Mrs. Richard Blight and her children, who live on Ronald Wickstead Avenue, also saw apparently this same strange light. And all of the witnesses, when interviewed, said that this light was brilliant, beautiful, and clearly strange. What a bizarre case that is. It does not appear that this man was actually taken on board, so perhaps this was a foiled onboard UFO encounter, and had he not been disturbed, he would have been taken on board. In any event, it's super interesting that he was sucked through this window and the window actually broke. It's also interesting that so many people in that exact area saw apparently the same object. So clearly something very unusual happened on that night. Now we move to the next case. This one also got quite a bit of attention. Don't know if you've heard of it before, but it definitely deserves to be well known. I call this one the humanoid on 3 Mile Lake Road. And I really feel for the witness in this case because the aftermath of this encounter was almost as traumatic as the encounter itself. This one took place on October 9, 1975 in Utterson. This is in Ontario, Canada. And while it is a single witness case, there's some really interesting aspects to it, as we shall see. Back in 1965, Robert A. Suffern, a carpenter married with 2 young boys, saw a UFO over his barn in Utterson, Ontario, Canada. Now this was just a simple sighting, and over the next few years, he had several other sightings of anomalous lights, at least 3 other sightings. But these in no way prepared him for a very dramatic encounter 10 years later with a landed UFO and humanoid, and of course the aftermath which followed. It all began on the evening of October 9, 1975, when his sister Shirley, who lived next door, called him to say that it looked like his barn was on fire. So Robert looked outside and he didn't see anything, but he did hear that his cattle were acting up. So he asked his sister Shirley to come over and watch his young child, and Robert took his car to go investigate. So he drove down 3 Mile Lake Road and, making a turn onto a side road, drove directly into the strangest experience of his life. Because right before him, sitting in the center of the road right ahead of him, was a strange metallic craft. As Robert says in his own words, and I quote, "I saw the ship in the center of the road. It was the color of the dull side of aluminum foil wrap, and the surface was irregular and crinkled. I could not hear any sound other than the motor of my car. I only saw it momentarily, and then it went straight up at a fast speed and disappeared. There were no lights. There was no dust, no apparent thrust, nothing. It went straight up and over the trees." So Robert estimates that this craft was about 12 to 14 feet in diameter, 9 feet high, circular in shape, and as Robert says, there was a black strip running around the circumference and what looked to be a small platform on the bottom of the vehicle. I was scared. It was right there in front of me with no lights and no sign of life. I really hadn't come to a full stop when it went straight up in the air and out of my sight. So at this point, Robert thought his encounter was over, but the most interesting part was yet to come, because he saw a humanoid, and in fact, he nearly ran over this UFO occupant with his car. And I'll just let Robert describe it in his own words. As Robert says, "I turned around and started for home, turned onto the 3 Mile Lake Road, and then I saw the thing on the side of the road. He was on the grass shoulder of the road and was about to cross from my right to my left. It suddenly pivoted and turned towards the pasture and vaulted over the fence and out of sight. It appeared to be short and had very broad shoulders, which seemed to be out of proportion. The movements were similar to an ape or a midget, but it was very agile. It reached up with its hands, grabbed the fence post, and vaulted over with no effort. It was like he was weightless. The head portion was covered in a globe, and I could not detect any mask or face portion. The suit was a silver color and one piece. The globe was a contrasting white or light color." So this figure was so close that Robert had to slam on his brakes to avoid hitting the creature. so he actually skidded. And this creature was about 4 to 5 feet tall. His car skidded to a stop, and by that time this being was only about 10, maybe 15 feet from his car. So after it ran off, he returned home. He told his sister what happened. He put the kids to bed, and he was watching TV when suddenly the sound stopped, the screen blacked out. He went outside to see if anything was going on, and sure enough, he saw an orange glowing object behind his barn, and it was moving off following the contour of the terrain, and it moved out over 3 Mile Lake nearby. So this entire encounter left him very badly shaken. He spoke with investigators and reporters, and as Robert says in his own words, "It's all right to think what you would do if you came face to face with a situation like this. But when it actually happens, you are scared because you are dealing with the unknown. I mean, what do you do if they come to the door? Offer them a beer?" Robert, of course, did tell his wife what happened. Both of them were somewhat alarmed, did not sleep well that night. In fact, as his wife says, "We didn't get any sleep at all. We were just too scared." So Robert at first intended to keep this secret, but finally he decided it was important to tell the police. And as Robert says, "We figured that the police wouldn't tell anyone. They would just make a report and pass it along to somebody." But that didn't happen. And in fact, an officer shared the story with a local radio station, and this story immediately went viral. The phone began ringing off the hook at Robert's home. Investigators, reporters, and curiosity seekers converged, and before long, people were actually lining up to see the encounter site, to get Robert's autograph, to hear his story firsthand. And Robert and his wife both began to regret going public. And at one point, this was nonstop, it became a circus. 2 men, Robert says, drove up to his house and actually threatened he and his family if he continued to talk to investigators. Robert wasn't having it. He immediately kicked them off of his property. But the aftermath of all of this went on and on. At school, his older child was ridiculed by other students even as late as 2 years following this encounter. So the aftermath was very traumatic. And as Robert's wife said, "This is incredible. I kind of wish we hadn't phoned the police. Maybe we had better pack our things. Our neighbors probably think we're crazy now, and we have no quiet here. Boy, I hope this ends soon. I need some sleep. No saucers, just sleep." Robert is sticking by his story, as he says, "I know what I saw, and seeing is believing, but I don't care whether I ever see that creature again. He went his way, and I went mine. I don't know why he landed there." So ultimately, he regretted going public because the aftermath was worse than the encounter itself. And in fact, the publicity got so bad, he had to disconnect his phone, and he refused any further interviews. And as Robert says, "I regret I reported what I saw because it is affecting my family life and my work. We have had to leave the house to eat properly. It is just not worth the hassle. If it happened all over again, I would never tell anybody." But he did, and boy did this have repercussions, because it was 1 month following the encounter that Robert says he and his wife were contacted by high-ranking military officials from both the Canadian and the U.S. government. They verified their identity. They arrived in full uniform with credentials that show that they were, in fact, from the Canada Air Force, the U.S. Air Force, the Pentagon, and the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. The men requested that the sufferers undergo a full physical exam, which they agreed to do. They were also questioned in depth about their experience, and these government officials answered all their questions as well. In fact, they said that these government officials showed them genuine photographs of UFOs and said that the governments were cooperating with the ETs, and said, and this is strange, that the Suffern's sighting was the result of a malfunctioning ET craft. How they would know that, I don't know, but it's certainly an interesting aspect to this case. There's a lot to learn from that case. I like the fact that this was a humanoid of a kind we don't normally hear a lot about. It shows how an encounter can profoundly affect a person. And the fact that this person was visited by government officials who were very curious about his encounter shows that this is a phenomenon that is in fact being taken very seriously by our governments, despite all the government denials that have been going on for decades, and let's face it, are still going on. Yes, we have recent steps towards disclosure, but it hasn't happened yet. There still is a UFO cover-up, and in my mind, until we see the Roswell craft and the bodies in a museum open for public examination, the cover-up is still in place. And now we move to the next case, which I call the crack-neck creature. This is a very unusual case which took place on October 10, 1976 at Crackneck Lookout in New South Wales. And it's an extraordinary case involving many, many witnesses and a very, very unusual humanoid. This case was investigated by Bill Chalker, a very well-known researcher from Australia. It was on October 10, 1976, that an anonymous woman was driving along the highway about 4 miles from the Crackneck Lookout in New South Wales, Australia. She was actually in a line of cars on the road. 2 cars were in front of her and 1 was behind. Suddenly, the car behind her accelerated and passed her and the 2 other cars in front of her and sped off at high speed. And it was just a few seconds later that this woman noticed that the 2 cars in front of her also suddenly, for no reason that she could see, accelerated away at very high speed. So something was going on. Puzzled and wondering why these other drivers sped off so quickly, this woman looked out her right window and was shocked to see a disc-shaped object with a dome on top about 75 feet up directly over her car, pacing it exactly. So frightened, as apparently the other drivers had been, she quickly accelerated and sped away. She reached the town ahead of her shortly later and actually saw one of the cars that she had been driving with pulled over, with 2 men outside of it talking and looking back down the road where they had just come from. So she also pulled over and looked, and sure enough, this object was still hovering low over the road where they had first seen it. This poor witness was so shaken up, she couldn't drive anymore. She called her husband to come pick her up, as she was too frightened to drive home. But this encounter wasn't over yet. It was at about 8 p.m. that evening that 2 young couples, we only know them by their first names, Tony and Linda, and Nigel and Mandy, had pulled over at the Crackneck Lookout, which overlooks the coast. And it was Linda who was surprised to see what looked like a strange orange light floating on the water's surface just off the coast. But she didn't think too much of it until about 15 minutes later, at 8:15, when the 2 men decided to look over the cliff's edge. And that's when they got the shock of their life. And I'll just quote one of the men directly, Tony, as he says in his own words, "We heard some noises down there. We walked down and heard the noises. We went up a bit further and heard more noises like grass rustling and shuffling. So we walked up to a little clearing on the side of the cliff and looked down, and we saw this thing crawling up the hill. It was an all off-white color. We ran all the way back to the car and got inside. I was shaking like anything. We locked all the doors. We said to the 2 girls, 'We saw something down there.' And they started to believe us. Then, all of a sudden, we saw this thing coming up through the trees. Nigel saw it first. He said to the rest of us that he saw it. We all looked down there, and Mandy, in front, started to just scream. I saw it from the knees to the head, all off-white, and its face. Its eyes were just like flies' eyes, and its mouth was just only round. I could distinctly see it had 3 joints in its arms. Its legs were huge. Its shoulders were about 36 inches across. Its fingers were pointed. It seemed to approach the car momentarily and looked away when the car lights came on. Nigel then reversed the car as quickly as possible and drove off. The creature also had no hair whatsoever. So this being, whatever it was very tall. They said it was somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall. Again, shoulders at least 3 feet wide. And as it turned out later, numerous people at this same Crackneck lookout would report seeing dark shapes in the area, hearing footsteps, strange anomalous lights at the foot of the cliff, and on or under the surface of the ocean. A few reported, quote, an invisible man sitting on the back of parked cars. So there was some speculation that there was a Bigfoot around this area, though the couple, Tony and Linda and Nigel and Mandy, said that whatever this thing was, it was hairless. So perhaps not a Bigfoot. Otherwise a very strange case. Apparently there's something about that area that is attracting these ETs, if that's what they are, UFOs. I don't know, there's always more questions, it seems like, than answers when it comes to this subject. But definitely an important case. And now we move to the last case of this bunch. I'd be surprised if you heard about this one, but it's certainly interesting given its location. And I call this one the Aliens at Stonehenge. This took place fairly recently on November 18, 1990. I guess that's not that recent. Now it's some 30, almost 35 years ago. But still a modern case. And took place, of course, at Stonehenge in Salisbury in the UK. It's a multiple witness case. It's got some very interesting physical effects to it. It was thoroughly investigated by researcher Albert Budden, so it's an important case and really unusual that it took place in such a famous location. This last case, again, was investigated by Albert Budden, and he writes, this case must be one of the most intriguing close encounter events of the past few years, although it has had very little publicity and is virtually unknown. So this encounter involves a couple known only by their first names, Dorn and Lee, who at around 8:30 p.m. on November 18, 1990, were driving from Wales to London. And as they drove along the A344 highway approaching Stonehenge, it was Dorn who first saw an eerie orange glow emanating from a copse of trees. And suddenly, rising up from these trees, was a 10-foot wide orange sphere, which rose 50 feet in the air almost directly above them. What's weird is this little grove of trees did not look quite normal. It looked almost flattish. And now here's this wide orange sphere rising above it. So she turns to her boyfriend or husband Lee and asked him about it. And strangely, he showed no interest and just dismissed it. Dorn, however, was shocked to see that this object, whatever it was now pacing their car on the right side. At this point, both of them were very puzzled to come upon a band of fog, they estimate about 2 feet wide, stretching across the road like a gate. And as they drove through it, something very strange happened. This weird, eerie silence and stillness settled over them, what Jenny Randles calls the Oz effect. And as Dorn said, it felt as if we were the only 2 people left in the world. Strangely, and as we see in many other cases, there was no traffic, which is odd because this is in fact Stonehenge, which is usually crowded. They had now reached the Stonehenge monument itself. Dorn tried to get Lee interested in the sphere, but he was strangely unimpressed. He did not want to look at it, though he did later say he had heard about UFOs disabling cars, and therefore purposefully left the engine running as they exited the car. So he did have the presence of mind to think that this might be a UFO they're dealing with. But strangely, and he can't explain it himself, he was more interested in watching the moon on the opposite side of where this UFO was hovering. So Dorn alone stared at this sphere, which he estimates was about 60 feet away, but it then began to do this kind of display, darting to the side and doing this series of aerial maneuvers that absolutely astonished her. She said it darted horizontally across the field, went straight up, went sideways again, winked out and reappeared, and dove downwards. She absolutely felt it was, quote, performing for her. So she repeatedly implored Lee to turn around and look, but he strangely refused. So finally, to try to get him to look, she asked him to go into the car and get the camera. And at this point, Lee suddenly screamed at her, very scared, to get into the car. He was apparently quite frightened and actually dove into the driver's seat. She hopped in right behind him, and he accelerated and screeched away from this area. They immediately hit another band of fog, just like the one they had entered as they exited this area. And Dorn looked and saw that this orange ball of light was still pacing them. Finally, a few miles later, they stopped to compare notes about what happened, and Lee explained why he had gotten so frightened. He said that while he was looking at Stonehenge and the moonlight shining down upon it, he saw a strange figure among the stones. He said it seemed to just appear. He did not see it arrive, it was just there. But he became really unnerved when this figure began to march towards him, stomping heavily on the ground. He said it moved quite quickly, faster than a normal person, and in fact, as it approached the security fence surrounding the monument, he saw that this was not a security guard as he first thought. Instead, it looked to him like this figure was 7 feet tall, very broad-shouldered. It was completely black and featureless from head to toe. And it had just reached the fence, and this is when Dorn called for the camera. So Lee says he had been actually kind of mesmerized by this figure's appearance, but hearing Dorn call for the camera, he snapped out of it, went into a panic, and screamed at Lee to get into the car. And at this point, he could see that this figure had somehow crossed over the security fence. He doesn't know how it did that, and was still approaching. And as he started the car, this figure reached the back end of the car. And as Lee put the car into gear, he said it actually came right up to the side of the car, and that's when he accelerated away. Now Dorn, her attention had been completely consumed by watching this UFO. She never saw the figure. And as Dorn says, well, Lee was telling me this happened, and I was telling him that happened, and it was ridiculous. Even though we had both been in the same situation, it was as if we had not been there together at all. They also noticed something else very strange. They had a fresh banana on the dashboard of the car, but it was now black, overripe, and oozing all over the dashboard. Both of them felt that that was very unusual. So they were talking all of this over, and they could still see this ball of light off in the distance. And they decided to keep driving, and suddenly they hit full traffic. And this is when they realized that this area should have had traffic during the encounter, but did not. And this is when Dorn says the high strangeness of it all hit her like a ton of bricks. She said it was very much like waking up from a dream almost. Now in the days following the encounter, they had some weird effects. They both noticed that objects around their house were being moved around, kind of like a poltergeist. Now Dorn says she did have a long history of paranormal events, including a prior UFO sighting quite close up. And she had had a lot of paranormal stuff, so was not overly alarmed when she began having ESP. But Lee, who prior to all of this was very skeptical of UFOs and the paranormal, he also began having ESP and telepathy, and this really upset him and freaked him out. So they later decided to return to the site to check it out, and Dorn noticed something very strange. She was unable to locate this grove of trees that she had seen the UFO emerge from. And this is when she remembered in hindsight that this grove of trees had had a sort of strangely two-dimensional look to it. So she wonders about that. Also, during this experience, she remembered reaching over the security fence to touch Stonehenge, the monument. But now she saw that this was actually impossible to do due to the height of the fence. She also remembered seeing hills when this encounter was going on, but now looking at the area, there were no hills. So there was a lot of strange things going on with this encounter, which perhaps involved more than just a sighting. Definitely appears to have some screen memories or something going on here. At any rate, this was again investigated by Albert Budden, and he speculates that this encounter, and frankly most of the others he believes, are caused by earthlights and magnetic fields and are essentially hallucinatory in nature. This is just his theory, but I figured I'd mention it since this was a case that he personally investigated. But certainly an interesting multiple witness case with a lot of unique details to it. A really interesting case for sure. I think what to me is so interesting about this is we see some of these details with the traffic being missing, this unusual, unnatural, eerie stillness, the reactions following the encounter, including what looks like a sort of psychic awakening. This may have been more than just a simple sighting involving a UFO and humanoids. Certainly possible, hard to say for sure, but absolutely an important case. So, there you go. 10 cases from all across the world involving people who saw humanoids face to face, half involving landings, a good number of cases there involving the range of evidence that we see. Again, landing traces, physical effects of various kinds, medical effects, animal reactions, electromagnetic disturbances, all types of evidence surrounding these encounters. So skeptics who say there's no evidence for this are simply not doing their homework. There is evidence. There are multiple witnesses. And it's hard to explain these cases as anything other than what they appear to be: extraterrestrial visitations. I know there are many different theories to account for these kinds of experiences, everything from interdimensional beings to time travelers and what have you. But I still feel like the evidence is best explained by the most popular explanation, which is extraterrestrial. And this is certainly what most witnesses, and I think most researchers, believe. But there's always more questions to be answered and more things to be figured out, which I think it's why it's so important that we take a look at these cases. This is why I do this research. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode and perhaps learned something. I truly appreciate you watching, so thanks so much for that. And until next time, keep asking questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important of all, like I always like to say, keep having fun. Bye for now.